So hello and welcome to yet another episode of Biographics. I'm your host, Karl Smallwood, and today we're talking about Vito Genovese, the deadly Don who backstabbed his way to the top of the Mafia. And this video is based on an original article by Radu Alexander. And I initially considered wearing like a proper suit and tie to fit with the Mafia theme, but I've just finished my yearly Sopranos rewatch, and if a shirt like this is good enough for a Don like Tony Soprano, it's good enough for me. Let's get to it. You don't get to the top without making a few enemies. That was the lesson that Vito Genovese knew all too well, but it did not deter him in the slightest. His lust for power was so strong that anything other than being the Don of the most powerful crime family in all of America would have been wholly unacceptable. There were plenty of obstacles in his way, obstacles that were just as dangerous as he was, but Genovese had no qualms about taking them head on, which he seemingly did with great success, achieving his goal of reaching the top of the criminal underworld while leaving behind a trail of bodies and victims who felt his wrath. Vito Genovese was born November 21st, 1897 in the town of Tofino in Naples, Italy. One of four children to Francis Genovese and Nunzita Alotto. When Vito was 15 years old, the family packed up and left Italy, immigrating to America. They arrived in New York and settled on Mulberry Street in the heart of, you guessed it, Little Italy. Pretty much from the get-go, as soon as he arrived in America, Vito was up to no good. He started out with petty crimes like thefts, knocking over push carts and the like. Even back then, the young Vito looked up to the mustachioed mobsters who held domain over the streets of Little Italy, running numbers and protection rackets. It wasn't long before he became an errand boy for them and later a collector who gathered lottery winnings. When he was 19, Genovese got busted for the first time for carrying a pistol, which earned him a 1-year stint in prison. Despite his efforts and even the jail term to boost his, at the time, fledgling credibility, Genovese was still small potatoes in the Mafia pecking order. His fortunes improved substantially, however, when he allied himself with another promising up-and-comer, a guy whose life and career would intertwine with that of Genovese from then on, a guy by the name of Salvatore Luciano, better known as Charles Lucky Luciano. Yeah! I also watch Boardwalk Empire every other year. It goes Boardwalk Empire and then Sopranos, so I know this dude. During the 1920s, Genovese and Luciano worked for a guy named Giuseppe Mazzaria, aka Joe the Boss. Mazzaria ran one of the most powerful crime families in New York City and spent the decade fighting to become the capo di capi, or boss of bosses. You know, a guy called Joe the Boss has to be the boss of all the bosses, right? Something which he achieved in 1928 after assassinating the previous boss, Salvatore di Aquila. And I would like to formally apologise now for my, let's put it bluntly, butchering of certain Italian names. I do not speak Italian, I have little familiarity with the language besides watching The Sopranos, but in The Sopranos they don't speak Italian, which is a running gag throughout the series. Anyway, like many mobsters of his day, Genovese took advantage of the Prohibition era during the 1920s and made a lot of money from bootlegging. He had his own operation together with Luciano and Frank Costello, another man who would play a big role in Genovese's life, and vice versa, for better and for worse. Mostly worse. They were backed financially by Jewish kingpin Arnold the Brain Rothstein and often had dealings with two young Jewish gangsters, Meir Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. This was something that didn't always sit well with some of the more, let's say, old school, but we could also say racist mobsters who thought that Italians should stick with Italians, and even then didn't like the idea of Sicilians getting into bed with Corsicans. And my mind only wanders to the eternal words of groundskeeper Willie. Like, you Scots sure are a contentious people. It's like, yes. Like, it's like Scots and the Japanese, or Scots and the English, or Scots and other Scots. Those damn Scots, they ruined Scotland. If you want to know more about any of these names we've just mentioned, Luciano, Costello, Siegel, Lansky, Rothstein, we've apparently already done bios on all of them, just waiting for you if you're looking for more of your Mafia fix. Those videos will have been hosted by our previous, more aerodynamic host, Simon Whistler. Moving swiftly on, Mazzaria's reign as the undisputed king of New York's underworld didn't last very long. Unsurprisingly, with that much power up for grabs, someone else would always inevitably step up to the challenge for the throne. That someone was Salvatore Maranzano, a member of the Sicilian Mafia who emigrated to Brooklyn to make a play for the criminal operations in New York. To achieve that, of course, he needed to eliminate Joe the Boss. In 1930, this triggered a violent power struggle known as, and this is a lot of Italian coming up, so let's see how well I do here, the Castellamarese War, after the town where Maranzano was born. I'm actually quite proud. I'm going to take a sip of my espresso. This is an espresso. I'm not tiny. My espresso cup fell on the floor, so this is like a Americano cup with an espresso in it, but I want it to feel Italian. We've talked about the Castelmaresa War before in some of our other mobster bios, so we're not going to harp on it too much now, but here's the gist. Guys like Masseria and Maranzano thought the old ways were best. They would fight for power, and whoever emerged triumphant reigned as the boss of all others, the capo di capi. But the younger guys like Luciano, Lansky and Genovese had, shall we say, other ideas. They reasoned that as long as there was one capo to rule them all, the New York families would be trapped in a perpetual power struggle where they would all be focused on killing each other instead of, making money doing crimes. So why not try something new? Kill both Masseria and Maranzano, get rid of all the old world traditionalists and form the Commission, a sort of governing body for the most powerful crime families in the country where there wouldn't be just one boss with final say over everything. Man, it's like the fact that gangsters figured out democracy is kind of wild to me. First at the gallows was Joe the Boss. He was killed on April 15th, 1931 while playing cards at a restaurant in Coney Island alongside his lieutenant. I'm not sure, do Americans pronounce lieutenant, lieutenant? I want to use both interchangeably to annoy everybody, so that way, none of us are happy. Look at Luciano. At one point, Luciano excused himself to go to the bathroom and 4 shooters, one of them alleged to be Vito Genovese himself, busted in and gunned down Masseria. In exchange for betraying his former employer, Luciano was given control over Masseria's crime family and became Maranzano's new second in command. But this was all just stalling for time. A few months later, a crew of Jewish hitmen stormed Maranzano's office and shot him to death. Similar fates awaited all of those who were stuck in the old ways, and afterwards, the Commission was born.
Does this ever happen to you? You're in the middle of doing something, only to get distracted by your phone ringing, but it turns out it's just a spam call. Whenever you submit personal information anywhere online, there is a chance that that information may be sold to someone else. There are data brokers out there whose sole purpose is to try and gather as much of your personal information as possible, and then sell that data to the highest bidder. You might be thinking, well, it's just spam, I can ignore it. The problem is these companies can do a lot more with your data than just call or email you. Insurance providers can use your personal data to raise your rates, and cybercriminals can steal your identity and use that to take out huge loans in your name. There's even the threat of your voice data being recorded, and for scammers to use that to artificially pretend to be you. The good news is you are not helpless here. These data brokers are legally obligated to delete your personal information if you request it. Sounds great, right? Well, no, because if you attempt to do this yourself, it will take you years to track down all of your information and get it removed. And even if you succeeded, these companies can just gather it all up again the next week. The sponsor of today's video, Incogni, is the solution to all of this. Incogni can reach out to data brokers on your behalf and request that all of your data be removed. It's actually an incredibly easy process. Just create an account and tell Incogni whose data it is that you would like them to look for. Then, grant them the right to work on your behalf, and that's it. Just sit back and watch as more and more of your data is removed from these insidious sites. If you sign up for Incogni at the link below using our code Biographics, you'll get an exclusive 60% off an annual plan. Take action today to protect your online data and save yourself from another one of life's annoyances. You can stop now.
With the Commission now in effect, there was no boss of all bosses anymore. New York's 5 families all had a seat at the table, as well as other powerful crime syndicates such as the Chicago Outfit and the Philly Mob. But make no mistake, this was no true egalitarian society either. The head of the most powerful family was still the one whose word carried the most weight, and that head was, unsurprisingly, Lucky Luciano. He maintained leadership of Masseria's former gang, named it after himself, and appointed his 2 close associates, Frank Costello and the subject of today's video, Vito Genovese, as his consigliere and underboss, respectively. And I'm so proud of myself for pronouncing that word, I assume correctly. Another sip of espresso. Following this, shall we say, drastic redistribution of power within America's organised crime network, Genovese found himself second in command of the most powerful mob outfit in the entire country, so he wasn't doing too bad for himself, all things considered. Although he aligned himself with guys who wanted to shake up the system like Luciano and Mayor Lansky, deep down he was too greedy, too ambitious to work within such a system. He wanted all the power for himself. He wanted to go back to the old ways. There was another matter though. While other mob bosses weren't quite so gung-ho when it came to violence because it attracted unwanted attention and stopped them making money doing crimes, it seems that Genovese only really knew how to solve problems one way: by shooting them. Case in point was 1934 when Genovese and another mobster named Ferdinand Boccia hustled about $150,000 out of a high-stakes poker game. Instead of paying Butcher his share, Genovese decided it was easier and cheaper to just have him whacked. The mob made a few enemies with its increased activity and whackings. Chief among them was New York prosecutor Thomas Dewey, who had declared war on organised crime. In 1936, he landed his biggest fish yet, Lucky Luciano, and sentenced him to 30 to 50 years on multiple counts of pandering. The appeal failed, and thus Luciano was headed to prison. This seemed bad for all members of the crime syndicate except for one person, our friend Vito, who was now the new acting boss of the family. Sure, Luciano was directing traffic from prison and Genovese was still basically just following his orders, but it was still one step closer to ultimate power. Unfortunately for Genovese, he did not get to enjoy his position for too long. Butcher's death came back to bite him in the ass, and in 1937, Vito feared that he would be indicted for his murder. You know, the murder he absolutely, definitely committed. With not a lot of alternatives, he had to flee the country, returning to Italy and settling in his native Naples. As always, Genovese was an opportunist who tried to align himself with the winning side, regardless of their motives or intention. Back in his native country, this meant buddy-buddy with none other than Il Duce himself, Benito Mussolini. I guess if you're going to be a mobster and you're going to aim high, I respect him swinging that high. Will people tell that I'm joking? Us British were very sarcastic. So Genovese used a connection he had with Mussolini's son-in-law, Count Ciano, whom the mobster had generously supplied with drugs in order to ingratiate himself with the dictator. Later, Vito cemented their relationship by organising the assassination of one of Mussolini's enemies back in New York City, the socialist newspaper editor, Karl. In gratitude, the dictator gave Genovese an Italian knighthood and named him, and here we go, got some more Italian coming up, Commendatore del Re. Of course, as we all know by now, Mussolini did not win the war. In 1943, the Allies invaded Italy and occupied it. Suddenly, Genovese's bond with Il Duce went the way of the dodo, and he switched sides, once again becoming an interpreter and liaison officer for the American forces. He was helped by the fact that nobody looked too deeply into his background to discover that he was actually wanted for murder back in the old US of A. Genovese further ingratiated himself with the US Army by helping them take down a number of black market operatives, admitting the fact that he only did this because he wanted to take over their operations for himself. This worked for a while, but eventually an overzealous officer with the Criminal Investigation Division found him out. Not only that, but he uncovered who Genovese truly was and that he needed to be sent back to America to stand trial for big ol' murder. Vito was extradited back to the US on June 1st, 1945. However, as often happens in trials against powerful mobsters with connections up the wazoo, the case against Vito started to fall apart, culminating with the mysterious, inexplicable death of chief witness Peter LaTempa, who was poisoned while in protective custody. With little choice, the charges against Genovese were dropped, and in 1946, he was a free man, ready to take back his place in the family. However, he was about to discover that things were not how he'd left them just 9 years earlier. While Genovese was away in Italy, Luciano was still in prison, and Frank Costello served as the new acting boss, appointing a guy called Willie Moretti as his underboss. But during the war, the American government employed the old enemy of my enemy is my friend tactic and secretly cooperated with the crime families in an attempt to prevent Nazi sabotage at home. Which kind of made sense on paper. After all, the mobs controlled the docks and the black markets, and in general were aware of all the shady goings on in the city, even those that did not directly concern them, so who better to ask for assistance? There's a little something called Operation Underworld, and how effective it truly was remains up for debate, but one thing is for certain, it was of great benefit to at least one person, Lucky Luciano. As you might expect, Luciano didn't agree to help out with the goodness of his heart or a sense of patriotism. He expected clemency for his past convictions, and he got it. In January 1946, Luciano was pardoned, ironically, by the very same man who'd put him behind bars, Thomas Dewey, who was now the governor of New York. But his freedom came with a big caveat. He was going to be deported back to Italy, never to step foot on American soil again. So when Vito came back to the fold, he found the boss of the Luciano family was thousands of miles away, with the new boss, Frank Costello, and his right-hand man, Moretti, had no intention of ceding power back to Genovese. Vito had been demoted to a mere captain, running his own crew once again. Obviously, for someone of his temperament and, let's say, ambition, something like this would never stand, but he needs to wait and pick the right time to make his move. Also in 1946 came something known as the Havana Conference, a major gathering of all the top mobsters in America, held in Cuba so that Luciano could attend. This was a landmark moment in the history of the American Mafia, considered the most important meeting ever since the Atlantic City Conference in 1929, where all of the up-and-coming gangsters decided to whack Mazzari and Maranzano and form the Commission. It's rumoured at this meeting Genovese approached Lucky in private and suggested that he step down as head of the Luciano family since he couldn't return to America. To save face, Vito suggested to Luciano that he could declare himself the boss of bosses, but in name only, while he would be the one running the family from day to day. Allegedly, Luciano is said to have replied, "There is no boss of bosses. I turned it down in front of everybody. If I ever change my mind, I will take the title, but it won't be up to you. Right now, you work for me, and I ain't in the mood to retire. Don't you ever let me hear this again, or I'll lose my temper." Supposedly, Luciano did indeed lose his temper that day, suspecting that Genovese was the one who tipped off the American authorities that he was hiding in Havana. He summoned Vito to his room and gave him a beating that broke a few ribs and forced Genovese to stay a few extra days in Cuba to heal. Even if this did happen, Genovese still ended up on the winning side regardless. When the American government found out that Lucky was in Cuba, it withheld all medical shipments to the country until the Cuban authorities arrested Luciano and deported him back to Italy. Running the family from Cuba was feasible. It was just a stone's throw away from Florida, and guys like Mayer and Lansky would be there all the time anyway to oversee their gambling and narcotic interests in Cuba. Trying to run it from Italy, though, was a whole other matter entirely. Regardless of how cool we tried to play it off, being stuck on the other side of the Atlantic severely limited and hampered Luciano's power and influence in the United States. He knew it, Genovese knew it, and everybody else knew it too. As far as Vito was concerned, he had gotten rid of Lucky as much as he could without actually having him killed. Now it was time to focus on his competition back in New York, Costello and Willie Moretti. First on the docket was the Luciano family underboss, Willie Moretti. Fortunately for Genovese, Moretti made things easy for him by having a real big mouth. Always a bad idea when you're in the mob. In 1950, a special committee headed by Senator Esther Cawthorne led a large-scale investigation into organised crime, calling in many prominent mobsters to testify and, most significantly, showing the whole thing on television. For many Americans at home, this was the first time they were being exposed to concepts like the Cosa Nostra. Although the other gangsters who had been called in to testify knew how to keep their mouths shut, Moretti was feeling chatty. It's not like he said anything incriminating, mind you, but he did like to tell jokes and taunt the committee and generally just mug for the cameras. The Mafia were understandably not happy with this turn of events because it made them look bad, and there is the belief that Moretti's actions on that day were the result of an advanced case of syphilis, and that as his mental faculties continued to deteriorate, he would become more and more unreliable. Eventually, with the commission's approval, Genovese gave the words "have Moretti whacked" in 1951, describing the whole thing as a mercy killing. With those two out of the way, there was only one man standing in Vito's way of becoming the new head of the family, and that man was Frank Costello. Taking out someone like Costello was easier said than done. The man wasn't known as the Prime Minister of the underworld for nothing. Even with Luciano in Italy, Costello still had connections, and his death would not be without consequence. So Genovese waited and waited, slowly but surely building up support for his eventual power play. He found a major ally in one Carlo Gambino, the underboss of the Mangiano crime family that would eventually be named after him. Gambino shared Genovese's ambition to climb to the top of the ladder and the ruthlessness to get it done. Also, like Genovese, Gambino had no love for the current boss of his own family, Albert Anastasia. This was like music to Vito's ears, since Anastasia was Costello's main ally and muscle in New York. Getting rid of the two of them together was essential in order to secure the top spots for Vito and his new friend with little fear of reprisal. So in 1957, it was finally time to strike. On May 2nd, 1957, Frank Costello was walking towards his apartment in Central Park West when a shadowy figure approached him, raised his gun, and as he let off a shot, reportedly shouted, "This is for you, Frank." And then bang, 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 like proper gangster style. Costello had no time to react, but fate was seemingly on his side that day. The bullet only grazed the side of his forehead and knocked him to the ground. Meanwhile, the gunman, seeing his target down from a headshot, made his getaway in a black Cadillac, not waiting around to see if Costello was actually dead or not. He'd been shot in the head, that tends to put people down for good. The shooter was Vincent the Chin Gigante, a protege of Genovese and a future boss of his family. Costello recognized him, but elected not to identify him, keeping in line with the Mafia's code of silence. However, he knew that this was not the end. He needed to find some way to settle things with Genovese, otherwise it was only a matter of time before he tried to have him whacked again. Therefore, in somewhat of a surprising move, Costello relinquished control of the Luciano family and retired, finally allowing Vito to claim the spot he coveted his entire life. The only loose ends left to tie up was Anastasia, but the attempt on his life was considerably more successful. On October 25th, 1957, two gunmen turned him into Swiss cheese at the barbershop at the Park Sheraton Hotel, ostensibly on Genovese's orders. Afterwards, Gambino became the head of his own family, renamed it after himself, as was tradition, and endorsed Vito Genovese's new position as chairman of the commission, in effect making him, at that point, the most powerful mobster in all of the United States. As the new head of the table, Genovese renamed his crime family after himself and insisted upon being called the admittedly quite badass Don Vito. But this was not enough for El Don Vito, and he wanted recognition from the other families. So he did something ballsy by even his own quite lofty balls standards. He called another summit like the one in Havana. This one took place on November 14th, 1957 in the small town of Apalachin, New York, in the estate of Joe Barbara, the head of the Buffalino crime family. Just the fact that Don Vito was able to organise this meeting and summon mobsters from all over the country, and even a couple from Italy, showed that most of the underworld already saw him as the new top dog. But it was nice to make it official. Topics of discussion that day included any lingering issues left from Anastasia's assassination and attempts on Frank Costello's life, the narcotics trade, and various other rackets. The meeting was supposed to be Don Vito's crowning moment, but it didn't exactly play out like that. The state troopers couldn't help but notice all of the really fancy out-of-state cars just showing up at the same time in a small town with a population of just 1,000 people. That kind of stuff tends to be suspicious. So they ran the plates and found that many of the vehicles were registered to known criminals. They drove their cars. Why drive your own car? Why drive the crime car to the crime meeting with other crime people? How do you get to be the boss of a family that commits crimes as its primary source of income and make a decision that stupid? So they did what anyone would do in that situation. They called reinforcements and set up a roadblock. There's even a rumour that the authorities were tipped off by Costello and Mayalensky, who did not attend the meeting and would have wanted to spoil Genovese's big day. If this was truly their work, they succeeded. State troopers raided the place and arrested around 60 of the biggest mobsters in the country at the time. Even if they were all eventually released without charge, it was still an inauspicious start for Genovese's reign as Don Vito. And it didn't really get any better from there. Don Vito enjoyed his time at the top for less than 2 years before being brought down on drug charges. Again, it was heavily rumoured that he was the victim of a conspiracy against him planned by his rivals, of which there were many, some of which were actually even still alive. Costello, Lansky, Luciano, and possibly even Carlo Gambino, who is said to have paid a Puerto Rican drug dealer to implicate Don Vito in the deal and get him arrested. Once again, if this is true, then the plan worked like a charm, and it showed that oftentimes deception and subterfuge were more efficient than backstabs and cold-blooded murder. 15 people were convicted following the drug bust, including Don Vito, who got 15 years in prison. Sure, he was still the Don, even behind the bars, and he could still delegate orders, but it wasn't the same. Not like he envisioned it. Plus, Don Vito was still unsure who betrayed him, so he ordered hits on several people close to him, including high-ranking members of his own family. One of his targets was Joe Valeschi, who was serving a sentence in the same prison as Genovese, but Valeschi managed to overpower the hitman, sent to snuff him out, and then turned state witness in exchange for protection, becoming the first prominent mobster to spill the Mafia's secrets for the whole world to know. And just a pro tip, if you send a hitman to kill someone, and that guy kills the hitman, that guy should be your hitman. It was one final blunder from the Don, who showed that you can't just use violence to solve every solution. Not if you want to live without repercussions. Vito Genovese never saw the light of freedom again, dying in prison on February 14th, 1969. He was 71 years old. So thank you for watching this episode of Biographics. As mentioned at the start, I've been your host, Karl Smallwood. This video is based on an original article by Radu Alexander. If they've provided social links for us, they will be linked below alongside my own. If you've enjoyed this video, why not leave a like? If you've got anything to say about it, leave a comment. And if you want to see more things like this, you can subscribe. We also have sister channels, Geographics and Top 10s, for which I'm also the interim host, as well as running my own channels, Wiki Weekends and Fact Fiend with Karl Smallwood. Otherwise, I hope everybody enjoyed this video, that you're having a good day, all that good stuff. And as always, I'd like to wish everybody the day that they deserve. Also, if you can watch The Sopranos, it's really funny.